Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
At my birthday dinner, the lights from the chandelier bounced off the polished glasses and white china, making the whole restaurant look like it was trying too hard to impress us, though in reality the tension at that table was already louder than any sparkle. I had chosen the place because it was elegant but not stuffy, somewhere I thought my parents would approve of, and where my coworkers wouldn't roll their eyes. I never imagined the food would become background noise to what would turn into the most humiliating moment of my life. My dad raised his glass just as the waiter placed the appetizers down, his voice sharp enough to slice through the polite chatter that had carried us through the first half hour. "Well," he said, with that smirk he always wears when he's about to make someone uncomfortable, "we all know who the real success is, your sister." For a second, the words just hovered in the air like a cruel little balloon, waiting for someone to pop it. The guests chuckled nervously. My mother smiled in that tight way she always does when she thinks Dad might have gone too far, but never stops him anyway. My sister, Julia, tilted her head with that fake modesty she's mastered since high school, the kind of smile that says she agrees, but wants everyone else to keep praising her. And me? I laughed too, but it felt like something cracked inside my chest. I tried to swallow it, to play along, but the glass in my hand suddenly felt heavier than it should have. I wanted to make a joke, something light, but before I could, another voice cut in. It came from my left, steady and calm, belonging to my boss, who had shown up only because my mother insisted he should join. "Interesting," he said, leaning forward in his chair, his fork still resting between his fingers as if he hadn't decided whether to take another bite. "Because her resume is sitting on my desk." The shift in the room was instant. The laughter died like someone had hit a mute button. My sister's eyes flicked up from her plate, and for the first time that evening, I saw something I had never seen on her face: panic. Her smile faltered, her hands fumbled with the napkin, and her skin turned a shade paler that clashed with the expensive blush she had painted on earlier. My father coughed, suddenly fascinated by the wine list, and my mother reached for her water glass like hydration was going to save her from the awkwardness she had helped orchestrate. I sat there, frozen but not shocked, because somewhere in the back of my mind I had always known Julia was capable of this. She had a way of walking through life convinced that everything was hers for the taking. When we were kids, if I left my toys unattended, she would claim them. In high school, if I studied hard for a test and mentioned any strategy, she'd use it and then brag about how clever she was. But I never thought she would step into my career, into the one place where I had clawed my way forward without anyone's help. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the clink of a fork against porcelain at the table behind us. My boss didn't elaborate, didn't soften the blow, just left it there like a dropped grenade. I wondered if he had planned it, if he wanted to see how I'd react, or if he was simply amused by the drama playing out at his employees' family dinner. Julia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her confidence leaking out of her like air from a balloon with a hidden pinprick. Inside me, two voices started to fight. One said, "Stay quiet, don't show weakness, let this pass." The other, louder, said, "Finally, here's proof. Here's the moment where her shiny little image cracks in front of everyone." My heart hammered in my chest as I forced my face to remain neutral, sipping from my glass of wine as if this was all just casual conversation. Julia finally tried to recover, her voice brittle. "Well, I applied just to see what was out there," she said, looking around the table for support, her eyes darting to my father, then my mother, as if either of them could swoop in and rescue her. Dad cleared his throat, but said nothing. Mom smiled, too wide, too desperate. And me? I tilted my head and gave her a look I knew she hated, the one that said, "Go on, dig yourself deeper." The waiter returned to ask about entrees, oblivious to the firestorm at our table. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but my chest felt too tight. My boss simply nodded politely and asked for the steak, as if he hadn't just set off a bomb. He didn't look at me again, but his words replayed in my head like a record stuck on one scratch. My sister's resume. On his desk. At my company. All those years of being compared to Julia, the prettier one, the smarter one, the one with the bigger future, had led to this. On my birthday. At my table, with my own boss as the messenger. And yet, as much as it stung, I saw something in her trembling hand under the table, in the way her jaw clenched as she pretended to chew her food. She wasn't untouchable anymore. By the time dessert menus came around, the room was still coated in tension. Julia didn't meet my eyes. My parents overcompensated with chatter about vacations they would never take. My boss excused himself early, with a polite nod to me that felt heavier than words. And I sat there, a smile stretched across my face, but inside, I was already planning. The humiliation was real, but so was the shift. For once, Julia had shown weakness, and I knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't just a dinner. This was the start of something I wasn't about to waste. When I finally blew out the single candle on the cake they shoved in front of me, I didn't make the usual wish. I didn't wish for happiness or luck or peace. I wished for clarity, the kind that turns pain into power. And as I looked across the table at my sister's pale face, I realized I had just gotten my gift. The restaurant scent of butter and charred steak followed me home like an unwanted souvenir, and while I washed off my makeup with hands that would not stop trembling, I replayed the dinner in brutal slow motion, every glance, every forced laugh, every sharp edge of my father's smirk, and I realized that if humiliation makes you small, clarity makes you dangerous, because in the quiet of my apartment with the city humming outside like a giant air conditioner, I could finally sort the noise from the signal and admit that Julia had not just crossed a line, she had chosen my career as her next shiny accessory and assumed I would accept it the way I always accepted her little thefts of attention, ideas, and space. I opened my laptop and logged into the applicant tracking portal I rarely touched because I kept my hands clean whenever we hired externally. Yet there it was, a familiar last name wrapped in an unfamiliar confidence. The kind of confidence that thinks changing the order of your middle name and your maiden name makes you invisible. And as my heart pounded that stupid heavy rhythm that means your body is angry before your brain allows it, I clicked open the resume and felt a cold distractingly precise anger settle in when I saw entire sentences that looked like they had been lifted from my last performance review, right down to the odd phrasing about building trust through ruthless clarity. A phrase I had coined in a late-night Slack with my manager after a miserable sprint, a phrase I had never shared at family dinners, and yet here it was, dressed up in Julia's font like it belonged to her mouth. I scrolled through the bullet points that were not so much lies as they were karaoke versions of my actual work, the same melodies with different words, and I pictured Julia sitting at her vanity with the pink lamp that flatters even the most tired skin, scrolling through my LinkedIn posts and our company blog and the public versions of my conference slides, collecting pieces like seashells and gluing them into a castle she planned to live in, and I felt that old split in me widen again, the part that wants to protect the family peace versus the part that wants to push the table over and let the plates shatter where they may. I stared a long time at the screen before writing a short, clinical note to HR about a potential data leak risk that might be exposing phrasing from internal reviews to external applicants, a deliberately bloodless sentence that triggered a routine audit and a temporary hold on external interviews for my department, which, technically speaking, was an integrity safeguard and not a personal vendetta. Yet the effect was the same as pulling the emergency brake on a train that someone I loved had decided to hitch a ride on without a ticket, and I told myself that this small act of control was not revenge so much as a boundary, the adult kind you make when you have run out of patience for being polite about other people's entitlement. Morning brought a hangover of indignation and a strange, steady resolve, so I dressed sharp, the kind of sharp that does not apologize for itself, and walked into the office ready to look my boss in the eye without flinching. Because if he had decided to throw a grenade at my birthday dinner, I could decide to pick up the shrapnel and melt it into something useful, and when he closed his office door and asked, in that careful tone men use when they think they are being sensitive, whether I had known about my sister's application, I took a breath and told him the truth with a straight spine, that I had not known, that I would prefer to keep family separate from work, and that if the team was considering external candidates for my track, We should at least agree on a blind case exercise that rewards original thinking over regurgitated jargon, a simple design challenge with a twist that would expose anyone trying to coast on borrowed phrases. He watched me with that quiet appraisal that always makes me suspicious, then nodded and said he valued my judgment and would ask the recruiter to circulate a short prompt to every candidate. A prompt with a deliberately flawed premise buried in paragraph 3 that only someone who actually understood our product would catch, and I said that sounded fair and professional, and I did not add that I had spent half the night crafting exactly that trap. One that would tempt a showy applicant to parrot the bad assumption back like it was gospel, because sometimes revenge works best when it wears the suit of process improvement and asks for a calendar invite. At lunch, I texted my mother a simple update that work was busy and dinner had been memorable, and she responded with a string of soft excuses about my father's sense of humor and Julia's ambition. And I realized I was not even angry at the excuses anymore, only tired, the kind of tired that makes you finally stop asking to be seen and start observing, and in that colder light I recognized that my family did not value fairness. They valued outcomes that made them feel secure, which meant Julia would never admit she had crossed a line. She would simply argue the line was always hers to move. That afternoon, I found a new request in my inbox from security asking me to confirm whether a personal Google document titled "Review Phrases to Keep" belonged to me, and my stomach dropped because I had never created anything with that title. Yet the sharing panel listed an old family email group my father maintained for holiday plans, and I felt a slice of nausea at the thought that someone had pulled language from somewhere they should not have reached, which meant my little integrity note to HR had landed closer to the truth than I intended, because this was not just messy, it was sloppy, and sloppiness is the fastest way to set yourself on fire in a professional world built from paper. I closed my laptop slowly, let the quiet of my desk surround me, and decided that the first move had been made and it had been clean, because calling for an audit and a blind case was not petty, it was reasonable. And it placed a mirror in front of anyone auditioning for my stage without naming her directly, which meant if Julia walked into that process brimming with confidence and empty on substance, the room would do the work I had been doing alone for years. Yet as the sun lowered and my screen filled with end-of-day clutter, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number containing a screenshot of a folder labeled with my childhood nickname and a single line beneath it. Nice phrases. Mind if I borrow a few more, which was not just a taunt. It was a signal that this was going to get uglier, and while a part of me wanted to choke on the fear, another part, the steadier part that had finally woken up, thought, good, now we are past the pretending. When I woke the next morning, the message from that anonymous number still burned in the back of my mind like a coal that refused to go out, and though I had tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a childish bluff, I could not escape the sinking feeling that Julia had somehow wormed her way deeper into places she did not belong, and that this time the stakes were no longer just bruised egos at family dinners, but the very foundation of the professional life I had built brick by brick, without anyone's help. As I made coffee and stood at the window watching the gray light climb over the buildings, I realized that fear had a strange way of clarifying the choices in front of you. I could either cower and hope the mess burned itself out, or I could step into it deliberately, choosing not to let her define the story I had spent years writing. By the time I arrived at the office, my decision was already made, though I wore it under the surface like a hidden weapon, because the best way to deal with someone who thrives on appearances is to give them exactly what they expect until the moment you don't. I greeted Julia that afternoon when she happened to stop by the building under the pretense of grabbing coffee nearby, her wide smile pretending this was all coincidence, though her eyes searched my face for cracks. Instead of confronting her, I leaned into warmth, asking questions about her week, nodding like a supportive sister, and offering advice about what to emphasize if she really did get that interview. The advice I gave was precise, but poisoned at the edges, small distortions of facts that would sound convincing until the moment a sharp ear caught the flaw. I told her our department valued aggressive restructuring projects, even though the last one had nearly sunk us. I mentioned that leadership adored buzzwords like gamification, even though our clients had laughed them out of the room last quarter. Each tip I delivered with the ease of sisterly wisdom, and she devoured them greedily, writing notes on her phone while tossing her hair back as if she had already been crowned. The act of guiding her felt surreal, like I was a magician handing the audience a deck I had stacked myself, and I wondered briefly if revenge loses its edge once it is dressed up as kindness. But then I remembered every time she had carved into my opportunities with a smile and a shrug, and the doubt evaporated. At work that week, I designed the case study exercise with a small twist hidden like a landmine. It described a fictional product expansion with a flaw baked into the budget model. A flaw that only someone who had actually managed similar projects would notice. The right move would be to call it out and redesign, but the wrong move, the tempting move, would be to repeat the numbers back confidently, parroting the surface without ever questioning the core. When Julia called me late one evening, her voice bright with a smug certainty that carried through the phone, she said she felt so prepared and thanked me for being supportive, and though part of me wanted to snap, to shout that she had no right to weaponize my work against me, I held back, because I had finally understood that revenge was not about loud explosions but about patience, about letting someone step into the trap you built with their own feet. The night before her interview, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the folder on my laptop where I had documented every line she had lifted, every phrase too specific to be coincidence, every screenshot of overlapping language between my reviews and her resume, and I debated whether to send it to HR or to keep it as insurance. In the end, I chose to wait, because I wanted her to walk into that room believing the crown was already on her head. Only then would the fall bruise deep enough to matter. On the morning of her big day, Julia strutted into the building in heels that clicked against the marble lobby floor like a metronome for her confidence, and I watched from a distance as she signed in with security, her voice pitched high with charm. My boss caught sight of me and offered the faintest smile, the kind that said he knew this was theater and was curious how the performance would end. I returned the smile but said nothing because the silence felt more powerful than any confession. I spent that hour pacing, my palms sweating, my nerves tight enough to snap, because even with all the traps laid and all the lines rehearsed, there was always the chance that Julia's audacity might carry her farther than it should. Yet when the door finally opened and she emerged, her face was chalk white beneath the expensive makeup, her eyes flashing with rage and disbelief, and she brushed past me without a word, muttering under her breath something that sounded like, "You'll regret this." I stood there, my heart hammering, but beneath the adrenaline was a surge of satisfaction that I refused to let show. Because in that moment, I knew the first act of my revenge had played out exactly as planned, and though I had not yet revealed my hand fully, I had planted the seed of doubt in her image, and doubt, once rooted, grows faster than pride. What I did not know was that in choosing silence and subtlety, I had also opened the door to a retaliation that would not play by the rules I had set, and the war between us had only just begun. The morning after Julia's disastrous interview, I walked into the office with the kind of quiet composure that comes only after you have watched someone who has tormented you for years finally stumble over their own arrogance. Yet beneath that calm exterior my nerves still hummed like live wires because I knew that humiliation alone would not end the story, and that Julia's pride was not the kind of pride that collapses gracefully, but the kind that grows sharp when wounded, searching for someone else to cut. I heard the whispers before I even reached my desk, colleagues murmuring about how an external candidate had sat across from the panel and, with confidence bordering on delusion, described leading a restructuring project that had never existed, and then doubled down when asked for specifics, citing statistics that contradicted themselves in the span of 2 sentences. One of the senior managers had apparently leaned back in his chair and asked, almost kindly, "Are you sure this happened here?" And Julia, unwilling to surrender, had insisted it had, referencing a fake client that never appeared in any of our records. The meeting had ended not with laughter but with silence so sharp it must have cut her deeper than any insult. I should have felt triumphant, and in a way I did, yet the triumph was tainted by something darker, a growing awareness that my victory was too visible, that colleagues who had once pitted my place in Julia's shadow were now watching me with a wary curiosity. as though they sensed I had guided her into that trap, and while they might not have known the specifics, the timing and the family connection made it all too easy for them to connect dots I had not meant to leave exposed. Later that afternoon, as I passed the glass wall of my boss's office, I saw Julia inside, her back stiff, her voice raised just enough that the syllables carried though not the words. And I froze because I had not expected her to return so quickly after such a failure. My boss's face was impassive, but his arms were crossed, and I knew that body language well enough to recognize disapproval. When the door finally opened and Julia swept out, her eyes caught mine, and the look she gave me was not the petty glare of a sibling rivalry, but the cold, deliberate promise of someone who had decided that escalation was not optional, but necessary. By evening the phone calls began. First from my father, his voice taut with anger as he accused me of sabotaging family harmony, as though harmony had ever existed when every dinner turned into a scoreboard for Julia's achievements. He said I had embarrassed her in front of professionals, that a sister should protect rather than expose, and though I tried to remind him that I had not invited her into my workplace, that she had chosen to walk there herself, he dismissed my words with a laugh that felt like a slap. My mother followed with softer tones, pleading for me to let it go because family mattered more than pride, but I heard the same undertone I had heard my whole life. Julia was fragile, Julia was precious, Julia must be protected at all costs, while I was expected to absorb the damage quietly. I hung up shaking, not from guilt but from the bitter clarity that my family would never acknowledge the difference between betrayal and ambition, and that in their eyes I was guilty, no matter how the truth bent. That night, as I sat on the edge of my bed scrolling through unread emails, my phone vibrated with another anonymous message, this one containing nothing more than a photograph of me leaving the office earlier, head bent, bag slung over my shoulder. The caption beneath it reading, "Funny how quickly things can flip. Better watch your back." My stomach nodded because whoever had sent it wanted me to feel hunted, and whether it was Julia herself or someone she had convinced to play messenger, the effect was the same, the sense that my carefully constructed control was slipping. I locked my doors twice and checked the windows, feeling foolish yet unable to shake the sensation that my sister had just crossed into territory that was no longer professional rivalry, but personal warfare. The next morning, my boss called me into his office, his tone measured, but his eyes sharp as he said, "Family mess shouldn't mix with business." He told me he respected my work, but that he could not allow our department to be pulled into ongoing drama, and though his words were diplomatic, the subtext was clear. If this feud spiraled any further, my own position could be threatened. I nodded, promising I would keep personal matters separate, even as I thought bitterly that I had been doing exactly that until Julia dragged her ambition into my world. Walking out of his office, I understood that the game had changed. This was no longer about one failed interview or one bruised ego. It was about survival, and survival required strategy sharper than anything I had used before. As the week dragged on, the silence from Julia was almost worse than her fury, because I knew she was plotting, and the unknown is always more dangerous than the blow you see coming. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder in the lobby, scanning my inbox for strange attachments, wondering which of my colleagues might be whispering with her on the side. When Friday came and the office emptied out, I sat alone at my desk staring at the city lights beyond the window, feeling both victorious and cornered, because I had won the first battle but awakened a war that had no clear rules. And as I closed my laptop and gathered my things, one thought pressed against my mind with the weight of inevitability. Julia would not stop until one of us was broken, and the question that haunted me most was not whether I could outwit her, but whether in outwitting her I might lose more than I was prepared to sacrifice. By the time Sunday rolled around and the city wore that washed-out silence that makes every storefront look like it is holding its breath, I had decided that fear could keep riding shotgun if it insisted, but it would not touch the steering wheel. Because I had spent enough years letting other people's appetites define the route, and if this week had taught me anything it was that a woman who keeps meticulous notes is never truly outgunned. She is simply waiting for the right audience. I started with the one thing Julia underestimated every time she tried to live inside my shadow. I documented the trail, not with petty screenshots buried in a folder named Revenge, but with an audit trail that any sober adult could follow. Beginning with the innocuous family email group my father maintained, and ending with the applicant portal log that showed a midnight access from a device that did not belong to me. And then, because style matters as much as substance when you are dealing with people who worship appearances, I wrapped the evidence in a visible act of generosity that would make any counterattack look like pettiness. On Monday, I sent a department-wide invite for a brown bag session I titled Ruthless Clarity, Real World, pitched not as a flex, but as a housekeeping talk about how we avoid jargon and keep clients from paying for elegant nonsense. And in that deck I placed a single sentence written in a deliberately odd rhythm, a sentence no normal person would say by accident. And I linked the read-only file to my work account with a unique watermark that would quietly ride along if someone tried to copy and paste it into their personal scrapbook. The session was well attended, not because my colleagues were desperate for wisdom, but because my story had become office folklore and people love a ringside seat when they think a reveal might be coming, yet I gave them nothing theatrical. Only calm examples and one wry joke about how ambition is a terrific engine until it starts drinking its own exhaust. I watched a handful of attendees snap photos from the back row, and I let them because the point of bait is not to hide it, the point is to make swallowing it feel like initiative. That evening, like clockwork, a new LinkedIn post appeared from Julia in a tone I recognized too well, full of high-gloss hunger polishing low-quality thought, and there, standing in the middle like a lamp on a lonely table, sat my odd sentence. Intact down to the off-kilter comma I had placed exactly where any decent editor would have fixed it, and although I felt that familiar surge of heat at the sight, I did not gloat. I simply forwarded the capture to HR with a neutral line about external reuse of internal educational material, and left the decision about consequences to people who get paid to be impartial. HR responded with corporate coolness, thanking me for safeguarding intellectual property and letting me know they would close the loop with the candidate and the referrer. They did not say, your sister, and I did not force the word into the air. Because sometimes power is knowing you do not need to say what everyone already understands. That alone would have been tidy, but tidy is not the same as satisfying, and after a week of anonymous messages and midnight surveillance of my own life, I wanted something that did not splash, but echoed. So I asked my father to meet me at a cafe he likes because the pastries remind him of his childhood, and I arrived early enough to choose the table with the mirror that let me watch his face without staring. When he sat down, full of familiar bluster that softened only when the first coffee hit, I did not argue or recite a monologue about fairness. I slid across the printed audit trail, the resume with my sentences, the portal logs with timestamps, the LinkedIn post with the watermark, the email header showing that our family list had been used to share my files months ago under the pretense of career brainstorming, and I watched the gears of denial grind as his eyes moved across the page. Because even the most stubborn loyalty has trouble arguing with a timestamp. He tried to say I had set a trap, which was not wrong, but I countered that traps only work on people who step where they do not belong, and then, because I am apparently incapable of resisting a little theater when the audience is right, I told him I was finished being the family doormat and had decided to become the whole hallway, which made him huff an unwilling laugh before he caught himself and returned to his script about blood being thicker than water. I let him keep the packet and stood to leave, saying that blood may be thick, but contracts are thicker, and that the next time he wanted harmony he should try honesty first. The final move was quiet and almost kind, and maybe that is why it felt like victory. I asked my boss to reassign me to a cross-functional initiative with external partners that would put my name on something too public to be easily rewritten by anyone. And I suggested, with a confidence I had earned the hard way, that we convert my brown bag into a quarterly clinic open to local grads and career changers, because inviting the world to learn costs me nothing and starves a copycat of the thrill of stealing from a locked pantry. He agreed, perhaps because it was good optics, perhaps because he believed in me, and perhaps because he understood that the best insurance policy against petty sabotage is to build a platform so visible that the truth becomes boring to argue. HR never told me exactly what they said to Julia, and my father never admitted he had been wrong, and the anonymous number never texted again, which should have felt conclusive and yet did not, because certainty is a luxury I no longer trust. And maybe that is the point. On the night the clinic announcement went live and my inbox filled with polite requests, I lay in bed wondering whether the original leak had even started with Julia or whether someone else had slipped the key into her hand and watched her open the wrong door with the glee of a spectator who never risks their own reputation. My phone buzzed once with a new message from a recruiter asking whether I would consider a role that sounded suspiciously like the one my sister had chased, and for a long minute I stared at it, feeling both vindicated and strangely hollow, because revenge, even when elegantly plated, has aftertaste, and as the room settled and the city moved through my window like a slow river, I realized that the more interesting question was not whether I had won, but what exactly I had taught the people who were still watching, and whether the door I had finally closed behind me would stay shut if the next hand that reached for it wore a smile I wanted to trust.